Go ahead and begin, if you would, turn in your Bibles over to 1 Samuel chapter 31, right, wrapping up the book of 1 Samuel tonight by looking at Saul's death. And this is a shorter chapter, so we'll be able to try to get through all of this tonight. Get that adjusted. There we go. Yeah, go ahead and change slide for me. Right, we know where we've left off in chapter 30. David's not with the Philistines as they're about to fight against Saul. David instead was fighting against the Amalekites because he was sent down to Ziklag. And, you know, we've talked about how David, in the moment of victory, does a lot of good things. The 200 men that stayed behind, David made sure that they got a fair portion from the battle. Because David understood that even though these 200 men were not present at the fighting, they still had a job to do, at least in terms of protecting the Israelites' belongings back at the brook Besor. We know that after David gets this victory, right, he doesn't take all the spoils of war for himself and for his men. He goes and he gives a lot of those spoils back to some men in Judah that had lost their possessions, that had lost their livestock and things of that nature. And David does this because he recognized how much the men of southern Judah, his own tribe, had lost because of the Amalekites. And as we'll see in chapter 1 and chapter 2 of 2 Samuel, this pays off for David because David's going to have a lot of support in southern Judah. And hopefully next Wednesday night we'll be able to look at a picture that sort of summarizes that, and it prepares us for the book of 2 Samuel. But when we come back to chapter 31, really the end of 1 Samuel culminates with the end of Saul's story. And that's what happens here. We again read about the fate of a king that has fallen out of favor with God. We know that when we talked about at the beginning of this section, really back in chapter 27, right, there were a couple of key questions we wanted to think about. And two of those questions, again, were centered around what all did David do while serving in the Philistine army. What all did he do in the service of the Philistines? Well, we know that he did win battles for the Philistines, and we saw that in chapter 30. We saw that in chapter 27 against some of the Philistines' enemies, like the Amalekites. But the good thing about it is that these were also Israel's enemies. And so David getting these victories for Philistia, he's not only helping them out, but he's also helping Israel out. And that'll come into play in 2 Samuel as well. We also know, and this is very important, even though David served in the armies of the enemy of Israel, David did not harm Israel in the process. Right? David was not a part of this attack in chapter 31, which is going to result in the death of a lot of Israelites and the death of the kings, or in the death of the Lord's anointed. You know, some might have said later on, you know, David, you were responsible for this, and we'll get to that in 2 Samuel 16. Some people argue, David, you had a hand in this, but we know that David was completely innocent of the matter. He was not with the army of the Philistines because he had just defeated the Amalekites in the south. But we also talked about another important question, and that was, what did David's absence mean for Israel spiritually? What did David's absence mean for Israel spiritually? Right? We know when David leaves, we know what happens to Saul. Right? Again, he continued his spiritual decline. And in chapter 28, the very final moral principle that Saul was clinging on to, he was willing to abandon it because he was so desperate in life. But in part of that was because he had driven David, the man of God, from his presence. We know now, and we're going to see in this chapter, with David gone from Israel, militarily, Israel doesn't have its greatest general, its greatest, we could say, its greatest strategist, perhaps, as David had won so many victories for Israel. And we see the end result of David's absence in chapter 31 because Israel's going to be defeated pretty severely by the Philistines. And so Saul, by the end of this chapter, Saul dies being a failure at what he was initially supposed to be. You remember when God was talking to Samuel in 1 Samuel chapter 9, that God told Samuel that Saul was going to be the captain of his people. And we talked about that word captain, basically meaning the protector of his people. That's what Saul's job was, to be the king. He didn't own the Israelites, but one of his main purposes was to protect the Israelites. And by the end of this chapter, we see that Saul has failed in that task. And that's going to allow for David to become king and to correct a lot of the wrongs that Saul had. And so now we come to chapter 31, looking at verses 1 and 2, looking at the battle on Mount Gilboa. Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines, and fell down slain in Mount Gilboa. And the Philistines followed hard upon Saul and upon his sons. And the Philistines slew Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchishua, Saul's sons. Now we don't have a lot of description here about the battle, and that's really because the main focus here is not on the battle itself, but what happens to King Saul. But there are a couple things we want to think about. We know that before this battle in chapter 28, that Saul had gone to visit that woman that had familiar spirits in Endor, right? He went to try to get counsel from God. This was Saul's last-ditch effort to try to get some positive news on the eve of battle. And this is a common thing. David did this on a number of occasions. We know at other places in the Bible where you see leaders trying to consult with God to figure out the plan of attack. But unfortunately for Saul, right, he was told that this is not going to turn out positively for you. Right? 1 Samuel chapter 28, verse 19, right, we read about the words to Saul again were, "Moreover, the Lord will also deliver Israel with thee into the hand of the Philistines, and tomorrow shalt thou and thy sons be with me. The Lord also shall deliver the host of Israel into the hand of the Philistines." And so, guess what? Chapter 31, the promise, the statement made here, it comes to pass. Unfortunately for Saul and unfortunately for the people of Israel. And again, this is a very, very serious defeat. This defeat here is very much comparable to what we read about in chapter 4, where right, was a judge that had basically allowed his sons to become corrupt, and he became corrupt as well. He was a very poor leader for Israel. And the end result is that, if you remember in chapter 4, the Israelites had battled the Philistines on that occasion. They get beat pretty soundly, and they lost the Ark of the Covenant. Eli's sons die in the process. You remember that there's a man from the tribe of Benjamin comes back to Eli and tells him what happens, and Eli falls over and he dies. And it was a very tragic thing because you had a serious defeat, and the leader of Israel perished in the process of it. Well, this happens here as well. We see verse 2, right? In chapter 31. We talked about before and we'll recap this next week when we look at a map, but right, the Philistines, they were camped in Shunem to the north. The Israelites were camped in Mount Gilboa, and there was a valley in between, and they met in the valley to fight. But we know that the Israelites were defeated, and that's the point of verse 1. They're defeated, they're retreating on Mount Gilboa, and this is where the events happen. Again, Saul, before he dies, he has to watch 3 of his sons die. Right? These are not all of his sons, but again, we'll see how some of his sons survive. But we do read about 3 of Saul's sons dying, and one of those was Jonathan. And was Jonathan a good or a bad man? Jonathan was a good man, right? Jonathan was the friend of David. We know Jonathan helped win battles for Israel, right, when he was under Saul. We know that Jonathan sided with David. Jonathan recognized David was going to be the next king. And unfortunately, you have the case here of a righteous man that has to pay for the sins of someone who is wicked. And sometimes that happens in life. Sometimes there are occasions where the righteous or people that are innocent have to pay for the sins of the wicked. I've seen, and if you've watched the news, you probably have seen this story. It seems like it happens maybe more frequently, at least in the past year or so. But you've seen stories where you read about a shooting or something like that, and you read about a child that was shot and killed in the process of that. And we know that the child didn't do anything wrong, that it was a circumstance of where that the child was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and unfortunately the bullet struck and killed them. But we know in that situation, right, that child didn't do anything, didn't deserve to die like that. He was innocent in the matter. The child didn't deserve that at all. But because of the wickedness of other people, an innocent life was lost because of that. The righteous suffered because of the sins of the wicked. You know, in the Old Testament, you read about that as the case was with Moses, for instance, right? Moses was not perfect, but we know, of course, that Moses was not allowed to enter into the promised land. We know that in the prophets, a lot of times when we talked about Amos, right? Amos was a righteous man, but at the same time, he was still facing the problems that came from the works of wicked men. Because sometimes the righteous suffer in life because of the wickedness of others. And unfortunately, that's something that we have to face as well. Sometimes we are caught up, we are innocent of matters, but maybe it's something at work, something goes wrong at work because somebody doesn't do their job right. And we might get chewed out, or we may get punished as a result of it, and we didn't do anything wrong. And unfortunately, that's a sad part of life, that the righteous have to pay for the sins of the wicked. And especially so that Jonathan, the son of Saul, is having to pay for the sins, or in a physical sense, dies as the result of his father's rebellion against God. Now we know what happens now looking at verse 3, right? And the battle went sore against Saul, and the archers hit him, and he was sore wounded of the archers. And let's go ahead and read 6. Then said Saul unto his armor-bearer, Draw thy sword, and thrust me through therewith, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and abuse me. But his armor-bearer would not, for he was sore afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword and fell upon it. And let's stop at verse 4. You know, Saul is in a desperate moment in life. And we have to think about it from Saul's perspective, right? You know, Saul has perhaps watched three of his sons die. And I've mentioned this before, but I've heard a preacher talk about this before, that and the way that he put it is that a son is supposed to bury his father, and a son is the one that's supposed to bury the father, and the father is not supposed to be the one to bury the son. Because I know you think about having kids and all that, having to watch, if you had to watch your sons die or your children die, that's going to be something that affects you pretty greatly. That's going to be something that, when that happens, that's a very tragic thing to experience, watching the death of your own children. And we have to keep that in mind, right? We know that Saul's own life is in jeopardy, but Saul's also had to watch his own kids die right in front of him. And if you're a parent, you know that there's nothing more heartbreaking than having to deal with that very thing. But now Saul is faced with threat as well. The archers are in range. Saul is wounded in the process, or at least wounded both physically and mentally with the fear that's created. We know that, here the main army has not gotten to Saul yet, right? He's been struck by an arrow. He recognizes what's happened. Perhaps, Saul's on Mount Gilboa. Perhaps when Saul's struck by that arrow, he looks down to that valley, and he can see the Philistine soldiers coming up the hill, knowing that they are going to come for him. And so Saul's mindset is, we've got to do something about that. And Saul's only position here, verse 4, right? He tells his armor-bearer, Draw your sword and thrust me through therewith, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and abuse me. So Saul's instruction to the armor-bearer, take my life. Well, why would he suggest that? Well, think about how he describes them, right? That they are uncircumcised. When this word was used by men of God, it was often used to separate people that were faithful to the law of Moses versus the Gentiles. We know that David, when he talked to Saul, called Goliath uncircumcised. He did that to distinguish himself as a child of God, being a part of God's people, versus Goliath, who was a Gentile. And so Saul might have felt a sense of shame, right? He's supposed to be the king, he's supposed to be the captain of God's people, and he's about to die at the hands of this uncircumcised Gentile. Perhaps there's a little bit of shame in that. But think about it like this, though, or think about this very basic point, right? Saul might have been a Jew, but Saul was separated from God just like the Gentile was he not? Right? Saul was separated from God because of his own rebellion. Saul might have thought to himself again, I'm still a Jew, right? He's still a Gentile. That's got to do something for me. But it doesn't matter if you're an enemy of God. You're still on the same level. And I think about it like this, right? I can be a Christian. I can be a Christian and I can take pride in that. But if I'm still living like the world, well, then my spiritual condition's no better than the worst sinner in the world, right? Because if I'm doing that which is not pleasing to God, I am an enemy of God. It doesn't matter if I've already been baptized. It doesn't matter, how much I attend church. It doesn't matter how much I put in the collection plate. If I'm living like the world and trying to do all these things, I'm still just as separated as one who's never obeyed the gospel. And perhaps Saul has forgotten this, right? These Philistines, he may have looked down upon them because they're Gentiles, but because he was an enemy of God, he was in the same spiritual condition that they were. Now you note too that Saul's afraid. Not just afraid of him, but also of what will happen to him, right? So these uncircumcised, verse 4, come and thrust me through and abuse me. Saul is afraid of what would happen to his body after death. If you've got your Bibles, I want you to turn for a moment to Judges chapter 16. When Saul is speaking there, maybe he has the story of Samson in mind. Right? We remember Samson, one of the judges of Israel, had long hair. Delilah tricks him into cutting his hair. And as a result, the Philistines take hold of him and they capture him. Now notice what it says beginning in verse 24. They've captured Samson. Verse 24, and when the people saw him, they praised their God, for they said, our God hath delivered unto our hands our enemy, and the destroyer of our country, which slew many of us. And it came to pass, when their hearts were merry, that they said, call for Samson, that he may make us sport. And they called for Samson out of the prison house, and he made them sport, and they set him between the pillars. You notice that word sport there in 26 or verse 25. Some translations have the word entertain there. And what the Philistines did to Samson, who was the leader of God's people, they captured him and they basically turned him into a sideshow, turned him into an entertainment piece, a symbol of Israel's defeat at the hands of the Philistines. And, he was abused in the process of that. Perhaps that's what Saul's thinking here. The same thing that happened to Samson, that the Philistines are going to do the same thing to me. And we'll know what happens here in a moment. That sort of connects back to the lesson we talked about on Sunday. But think about it for a moment, right? This is sort of a silly thing, right? Here's Saul worried about, what's going to happen to his body, right? Saul's worried here about what could happen to his physical form, not just, again, the phrase come and thrust me through, that would be the idea of killing. But you think about Saul worrying about what happens to his body after death, right? I find that to be a little bit ironic, right? We know what happens to the human body, right? It decays, it decomposes. I know that some people have certain preferences for what they want done to their body when they die, right? Whether that's a proper burial through a coffin, whether that's cremation or something like that. But when our body die, when we die, it doesn't really matter what happens to our body, right? It doesn't matter. Our soul's gone. That's what makes us who we are, is our soul. And I just, again, find it interesting here in the moment of death that Saul's more concerned about what happens to his physical body than he's concerned about what's going on with his soul. You think about that. I think about what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 10, verse 28, where on that occasion Jesus told his disciples, "Fear not them which kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul, but rather fear him which is able to destroy both soul, which is able to destroy both soul and body in hell." And that's part of the point that Jesus was getting at there, right? Your physical body is your physical body. It was never designed to. Our physical body decays, right? We know that it's not designed to last forever because of what happened in the Garden of Eden. And what we're talking about at camp is actually 2 Corinthians 5, where Paul talked about we groan in our earthly body. We long to have that heavenly body because we know that our physical body is temporary and we're longing for eternity. But the sad thing here about Saul is he's more concerned about his physical body after his soul separates from his body than he is concerned about the resting place of his soul. And that's a lesson for us as well, right? The soul is what matters. We mentioned that, I know, in our sermon this past week, right? Matthew 16, verse 26. What does a man profit if he gain the whole world and lose his own soul? You can't put a price tag on that. And Saul, unfortunately, didn't recognize that. Now note that when Saul gives this command, right, he gives this order, that the armor bearer refuses to do that. Again, verse 4, his armor bearer would not, for he was sore afraid. Therefore Saul took the sword and fell upon it. Now you keep in mind that David at one point was Saul's armor bearer. And part of the responsibility of the armor bearer was to protect the king. You held his armor and you protected the king. And this could help us explain again why the armor bearer doesn't act, even though the king's given him this order. If you couldn't protect the king, if that was your sole job and you couldn't do it, there's a lot of shame attached to it. In 1 Samuel 26, we talked about when David entered into the camp, that when he came out, he talked to Abner first, and he told Abner how close he got to killing Saul. And that was done to shame Abner, because he had failed to do his job. And perhaps the armor bearer doesn't want to fail to do his job to protect the king. He's not going to take his own life. Also, you think about the fact that he's just not going to kill the Lord's anointed. He's not going to be the one to kill the king. Just as David recognized that he did not have the right to kill the king. And that results in Saul taking his own life. Right? Saul took a sword, fell upon it. His armor bearer saw that Saul was dead. He fell likewise upon his sword and died with him. So Saul died, and his 3 sons and his armor bearer and all his men the same day gathered together. Saul's story here is a good example about what it's like to not have hope when we are apart from God. Paul had hope when he was a Christian. I want you to turn in your Bibles for a moment to 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 6 through 9. I mentioned a moment ago, right? Saul talked about in that chapter longing for that heavenly body, willing to separate, to depart from this earthly body, this, as he calls it there, this earthly tabernacle that decays and that we groan and we sometimes are fed up with the pain of the physical body. And Paul talks about this confidence that he has about where his position is when he dies, right? Verse 6 of 2 Corinthians 5, therefore we are always confident, knowing that while we are at home in the body, we are absent from the Lord. Right? Paul understood that. And while I'm here on earth, I'm not with God, for we walk by faith, not by sight. We are confident, I say, and willing rather to be absent from the body and to be present with the Lord. You see, Paul didn't fear death. He didn't fear what would happen to his physical body when he was sitting in a Roman prison, because it didn't matter. He knew where his soul was going to be, present with the Lord. But he said in verse 9, wherefore we labor that whether present or absent, we may be accepted of him. And that was the confidence that Paul had, that if I do everything that I can for God in this life, I can be just as confident that my soul will be with God in eternity. But Saul has separated himself from God, right? Chapter 28, Saul had separated himself from God. Saul did not have that same hope, and that led him to a very drastic conclusion in his life. Paul would later say in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 12, talking to those Christians that at one point were Gentiles, that they were aliens of the covenant. They were strangers from the commonwealth of Israel. And Paul simply said in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 12, you had no hope in this life. You had no hope in this life. But now they had hope and they had a reason to live. Saul's separation from God resulted in him not having any hope to continue on, and leads him to this very drastic decision to take his own life. I think this is interesting to point out the comparison between David and Saul when David fought Goliath. You remember that David didn't have any physical armor on, right? He tried on Saul's armor, but he hadn't proved it. Armor was too big for him. David went before Goliath, didn't have any physical armor on, but he had his spiritual armor on. Because we know that he trusted in God. And David was successful, right? He killed Goliath in that process. But you think about in 1 Samuel 31, when Saul dies, Saul didn't have the spiritual armor on. He was separated from God, but Saul did have his own physical armor on. That at least was probably the best in all of Israel. The king had the best armor in all of Israel. But yet, Saul, with that best physical armor, did not live. He died. He lost his physical body. He also lost his soul in the process because he wasn't concerned about it. And then, as a result, Saul dies. The armor bearer also takes his life. Perhaps fearing for what could happen to him. And this is a very sad occasion. Even though Saul's a wicked man, this is not meant to be a very joyous passage to read. Because you read about a servant of God who at one point was extremely faithful, who had won a lot of battles for Israel. But you unfortunately have to read about the decline of this servant into an individual that was completely rebellious against God. And as a result, not only does Saul die, his armor bearer and the 3 men die, Israel pays the price as well. Look at verse 7. And when the men of Israel that were on the other side of the valley, and they that were on the other side of Jordan, saw that the men of Israel fled, and that Saul and his sons were dead, they forsook the cities and fled, and the Philistines came and dwelt in them. You know, we talked about again that sometimes good people suffer as the result of wicked individuals. No doubt there would have been a lot of good people in Israel there, perhaps, that lost their land, lost their territory because of the defeat of the Israelites. Sometimes in war that's sort of natural. That's a natural thing that happens, right? Losing territory. That's sort of how you can define victory sometimes. But you remember here that while Israel has lost territory in the north now because of Saul's wickedness, right, and the Israelites' defeat, you remember what happened in chapter 30, what happened in southern Israel, right, where the Israelites are victorious, or at least they're victorious in getting their possessions and things like that back. And that shows the difference between David and Saul, right? Saul, the final moment of his life is a military disaster, while David has had military success because he is the man of God. He has God's favor. Now note what happens to Saul here in verse 8. We're going to go through the rest of these verses a little bit quicker. Right, verse 8, Philistines have taken these cities, they come back to the battle site, or they take the cities over the process of time, but the following day they come and find Saul's body. Verse 8, it came to pass on the morrow when the Philistines came to strip the slain that they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen in Mount Gilboa. And they cut off his head and stripped off his armor and sent into the land of the Philistines round about to publish in the house of their idols and among the people. And they put his armor in the house of Ashtaroth, and they fastened his body to the wall of Bethshan. And what happens here is something similar that we talked about with the Tower of Babel on Sunday. You know, we talked about how those men at Babel, they weren't satisfied with their position. They wanted something better because they wanted to have a greater name and they wanted to prevent themselves from dispersing throughout the world and to try to keep themselves physically strong. And so, again, they decided to build that tower. And as we talked about what happened at the end of that, they did it out of pride. They did that and it displeased God. And the end result of that was that now we know the name, the Tower of Babel. We don't think about it because we can go and visit that tower. We know it because of the wickedness of the men there. They wanted a positive, well-respected name, but instead, because they became disobedient to God, they received a very negative name. Likewise, they were worried about being scattered abroad. And we know what happens at the end of the story of the Tower of Babel. They are scattered abroad. Their worst fears come to a realization because they could not be content with what they had, and they decided to be rebellious against God. And I think the comparison is very natural because Saul in verse 4, he's worried about what they would do to his body, right? They're worried about what they would do to his body. And he didn't want his body basically to be made into a trophy, but verses 8 through 10, that's exactly what they do. They turn his body into a trophy. They go and they cut off his head. The news of his death is passed around. Verse 9, the idea of publishing in the house of their idols and among the people, the idea there of publishing in the house of their idols sort of carries the idea of them giving their gods credit for the victory. You know, just like David gave God credit for the victory when he killed Goliath, these Philistines were giving credit to their God for the victory because of the death of Saul. But we know that this is not because their gods were victorious so much as it was God rendering punishment to Saul for his wickedness. But at the same time, Israel pays a price as well. You note again, verse 10, they take his armor, they put it in the house of Ashtaroth. Some think that this god that's mentioned here, Ashtaroth, is one of the gods of war. So in this culture, it would have been natural after a military victory to give a prize to their military god. And that's what they're doing there, putting Saul's armor in his house. It says also that they fastened his body to the wall in Bethshan, and it was made into a trophy. But here comes verses 11 through 13. This is where we draw to a close tonight, where Saul's body is going to be given a little bit of a more proper resting place. Verse 11, and when the inhabitants of Jabesh-Gilead heard of that which the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men arose and went all night and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall of Bethshan and came to Jabesh and burnt them there. And they took their bones and buried them under a tree at Jabesh and fasted 7 days. Now, we don't have time to read this, but if you want to put in your Bibles with these first 3 verses, if you don't have there as a cross reference, you want to put in 1 Samuel 11. When you're looking at these 3 verses, you want to have 1 Samuel 11 there. Because in 1 Samuel 11, Saul rescued the men of Jabesh-Gilead from the Ammonites. And Saul was well liked in Jabesh-Gilead. And that's why, even though Saul is the enemy of God, the men of Jabesh-Gilead go and they take Saul's body. And as they said there, verse 12, they take his body and they basically give him a proper burial, and they fasted for 7 days. The idea of mourning there. But the reason why they did that is because Saul, at the very beginning of his reign, or at the very beginning when he was called to be the leader, he had saved the men of Jabesh-Gilead. And that's why they take his body and give it a proper burial. Now next week we'll talk about the aftermath of this from the perspective of David. You know, while some people would look at this as if some people were in David's shoes, they would look at this as a joyous occasion. The man that had been hunting David down for basically the last third of this book has finally died. David's greatest threat, basically, at least in this life, at least physical threat, has perished. He's passed away. And most people that would be in David's shoes would thank God for it. They'd be happy for it. They'd throw a feast. They'd have a party because of Saul's death. But David was not that type of man, and we'll read about what happens in 2 Samuel 1. But David shows that even in Saul's death, he remained loyal to him by how he handles by how he handles the servant that comes and boasts about Saul's death. But we'll stop there tonight. We'll start 2 Samuel next Wednesday. But thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. Are there any comments or questions that you'd like to add on? If not, we again will stop there, and we'll pick up in 2 Samuel 1 next week.